Sure. My name's Robbie Collin. I'm the Telegraph film critic, and I've been here for about 7 years now. Started out as a feature writer on another newspaper, and then it's the same for all film critics. I think you wait until the previous film critic is on holiday or on maternity, paternity leave, or otherwise indisposed, and then you kind of do a little bit of holiday cover, and then when they move on, you step into their shoes. And so that's how it kind of worked. And then joined the Telegraph in 2011 and have been very contentedly in the cinema for them day in, day out ever since. I love The Shape of Water, and for me it was an interesting Best Picture winner because after the ceremony, I think there was a certain sense of flatness about this year's Oscar ceremony, and it's strange to think that a film that is in its particular way as radical as The Shape of Water, a director like Guillermo del Toro, who 10 years ago the idea of him winning Best Picture would have sounded insane. This year, to me anyway, it felt like quite a safe choice. And I think that is because of the amount of upheaval that's going on in Hollywood at the moment with Me Too and with Time's Up movement and all of this stuff that's happening. There's a sense that the Oscars should be reflecting that. And for a film like The Shape of Water to win, goodness, I love it. I give it 5 stars in my review for the Telegraph, and really enjoyed seeing it for a second time as well. But to me, it felt slightly safe, in a year where you had things like Get Out, Lady Bird, even a film like Dunkirk, which is a very traditional subject matter, but the film is executed in, to me, a very radical way. I would have loved to have seen the Oscars really stuck their necks out, as they did last year with Moonlight, and chosen something that felt a little bit braver and a little bit more of a choice for the ages, shall we say. Oh, really? Okay, wow. I think what's been really interesting about the Time's Up and Me Too movements is that on the one hand, you have people saying, of course, we knew all along, everyone knew all along, this was an open secret in the industry. And on the other hand, you have people saying, I had no idea, this is completely out of the blue. I was interviewing Paul Feig a couple of days ago, the director of Bridesmaids and the recent Ghostbusters remake. And he had said it had come to him as a total surprise. And I think because he's in this kind of bubble of comedy, and particularly quite progressive comedy, quite liberal left-wing persuasion comedy, the people that he is associating with, they're not these kind of Machiavellian schemers and abusers that have been coming out of the woodwork. And so for him, it was a big surprise. For other people who have been, I think, possibly more intensively involved in the festival circuit and in the awards circuit, where they're aware that there is this, there's been this very long-standing culture of powerful men imposing themselves in all sorts of horrific ways on young women who are in vulnerable positions in the industry. It didn't come as a surprise at all. To me, as a total outsider, I was really taken aback by the scale of it. You see Harvey Weinstein, having his photo taken with the young actress, and you think, okay, so that's obviously professionally advantageous to her to be hanging around with a guy, but you would never have, I certainly would never have thought that this had all been going on as well. So what's interesting now is how much of a lesson the industry is prepared to learn, and whether they kind of sweep what's happened, they address what's happened now and then sort of move on from it, rather than looking at a kind of systemic root and branch change to make sure this kind of thing can just never happen again. It would be very, very easy, I think, particularly for a business that's so skillful at manipulating images and giving the right impression, as Hollywood is, to be able to look like they were doing a lot of good things and actually just move on and not really get to the source of this poison and properly lance it. My hope is, of course, that they do, but the proof of that will only, it will only come out in 5 years, 10 years time when we're aware that the industry has moved past this point. But I think that what's interesting is that this is something that's very associated with the film industry. But if it's endemic in the film industry, there's no question it's endemic in other businesses as well. And it's good that even though this has been going on for so long, that at least Hollywood is, in a sense, or hopefully this is what they're doing, but they're leading by example, so that other businesses, other workplaces that aren't necessarily as anywhere have the same public profile as film, will kind of take heed and will hopefully follow suit. I think, well, look, everything that Hollywood does, they do it primarily because there's money to be made. It's a business, and that's absolutely, they will invest in something because they believe there will be at least the prospect of a better payout than their down payment. So the fact that they're now spending money on films like Wonder Woman, female-led blockbusters, Tomb Raider as well, rebooting that franchise now, there's no question they're doing it because they believe there's an audience out there that is underserved and that will turn out in force to support these films. Now, it just so happens, I think, at this point in history, that doing the right thing commercially falls in line exactly with doing the right thing ethically. And to me, it's insane. If you look at the box office numbers for Black Panther, for example, which I think is now the highest grossing superhero film of all time. It's overtaken the first Avengers film just recently. That was there for the making. Anyone in the last, since Iron Man was released, could have stepped up and made a majority black cast superhero film. And the audience was there and they were waiting for it, and nobody did. And the fact that Disney, obviously this incredibly well-resourced studio, has decided to do this and has reaped enormous commercial reward for doing so, will hopefully only encourage it. To me, it's the money making is kind of by the by, but like the fact that the audience exists for these films and is finally being well served is very exciting. And you saw the same thing happen with the Hunger Games as well. Goodness, when that film hit as big as it did, and Twilight as well beforehand, it was as if studios suddenly realised, oh yeah, there's girls around as well, and they like to see stories too that are aimed at them. It's a very, aesthetically, it's an incredibly conservative business, and people don't pursue ideas that haven't been proven to, haven't necessarily been proven to provide a big financial return beforehand. So the fact that that's now happening, even if it's for totally commercial motives, to me as a critic is very exciting, because it means we see more stories from different backgrounds, different sources, different ideas on screen. I think the idea is this in terms of having a female action hero, or a heroine, a strong heroine at the core of a sort of a mainstream film, for want of a better way of putting it. I think when you look at the history of action films with women in lead roles, it's something you can kind of trace back to blaxploitation, really, and Pam Grier. I would say Pam Grier is probably the first actress who really took on a role like that. And although films like Coffee are sort of notionally empowering, and because they're part of blaxploitation, they're empowering in a different way as well. Race is a concern there as well as gender, but they're obviously titillating as well, and a big part of them. Like there's this incredible scene in, I think it's Coffee, in which Pam Grier uses her tongue to kind of unlock handcuffs, or she's tied to bed and she somehow uses her tongue to kind of unpick the lock that's holding her there. So it's purely, it's there primarily for titillation. But what you can see is that when you have a female action hero, the kind of things you can do with that character purely because they're female are completely different. They're vulnerable in different ways. They're powerful in different ways to Bruce Willis running around in a vest and with a machine gun. So it opens up different kinds of storytelling. And that is, you mentioned films like Aliens, Sigourney Weaver in those films, and Linda Fiorentino in Terminator 2 as well. This isn't a totally new discovery by Hollywood, but it's almost as if they need to keep remembering and being reminded that this is something you can do. Like, it's as if the male action hero is the kind of baseline, normal default setting for these things, and you need to have something hit big like Wonder Woman in order for the studios to remember that this is something they can do and that they can do very well. I think Wonder Woman was a great film, and one of the most exciting things about it for me was to see a heroine, particularly one that looks like Gal Gadot, who's total kind of movie star, beautiful actress, being photographed in a way that is incredibly glamorous, but is not. It doesn't have that kind of extra leery edge that if you go back to Pam Grier, as I was talking about, that that was kind of happening there and has been happening on and off all along through this. These new perspectives are what is always exciting to me when cinema opens up a new way of looking at things. Be that a heroine or a landscape or a particular social issue. That to me is always very exciting. And so this new generation of heroes, and I think we'll probably almost definitely see this with Brie Larson's Captain Marvel film that's coming up as well. That's great. These kind of sexualized images of superheroes, female superheroes, you don't have to look hard to find them. What's exciting about what's happening now is that not every female superheroine, every female action heroine is sexualized by default. That's something you can do, but you don't necessarily have to do. I think, when you watch a lot of films week in, week out, you realise when you get to the end of the year that there could be any number of films up for Oscars. There are so many deserving performances that are as good or better than what's recognised at every February or early March by the Academy. And what it boils down to is how films insinuate themselves into the Oscar conversation. How do you start getting talked about as a potential contender in awards season? That to me is what's kind of interesting with what's going on now, because people are thinking about films that they wouldn't necessarily have thought of as awards contenders beforehand, as not just contenders, but frontrunners. Moonlight, for example, not because it's got black characters, but because that is a film that is shot in this incredibly poetic, lyrical way. It owes all sorts of, aesthetic debts to filmmakers like Wong Kar-wai and Lynn Ramsey, people whose own work would never be considered for Oscars. Barry Jenkins is shooting in that style, and there, suddenly it's a front runner, which is great news. So it's this idea that the actual voters themselves, and this is something BAFTA really seriously needs to get to grips with as well, in terms of honouring smaller budget British films, not in terms of race, but just in terms of everything. Don't just kind of look for the default inspiring historical biopics, things like The Post and Darkest Hour, great films as those are. There are other kinds of films that you can reward. There are other kinds of performances you can recognise. So I think if, for example, a year came, and I don't think this will ever happen, but where all the Oscar Best Actor nominees are black, to me that's no more bizarre than if they're all white, because there are umpteen great performances throughout the year from people of all different racial backgrounds that should equally be up there. The trick is getting these performances talked about in a way that makes people think, oh yeah, I should vote for that person. I mean, my hope is that it's not a trend, is that it's just a change. And I think for a lot of time, what you have to remember is that LGBTQ audiences have been watching straight stories, since the start of cinema, and they've kind of met them on their terms, and it seems absurd that straight audiences can't do the same thing in the other direction and enjoy the film as much as those audiences were enjoying the previous films. A huge part of cinema is about having a new way of looking at the world opened up to you. There was a film by Celine Sciamma that came out a few years ago called Girlhood that was set in the kind of Paris banlieues about these young black women, or really, really black teenagers who were on the cusp of womanhood, sort of discovering really who they were. And, just miles and miles and miles away from my own upbringing, geographically, culturally, everythingly. But to watch a film like that and to feel like you're living through the things that they're living through, to me, that's one of the great things, the best things that cinema can do, to give you that kind of someone else's lived experience, even if only for an hour, 2 hours, or however long the film lasts for. So my hope is that more straight cinema goers will wake up to this fact and realise that you can go to see a film that isn't about someone that's exactly like you and still be incredibly moved and inspired by it. Paddy, a really, really good example of this. New film coming out this week, Journeyman, the boxing film by Paddy Considine. To look at me, obviously, this is very clear, but I'm not, a boxer. I've got no real interest in boxing whatsoever. But the way in which he deals with this boxer's story, and that he suffers this kind of concussive head trauma, and has to basically rebuild who he is from the ground up. It's a really it's a story that isn't just about boxing. It's a story about what it means to be male, to what masculinity counts for. Being a provider, being a lover, being a community hero, and he has to come to terms with what all those things are and what life is like without all those things, in order to start rebuilding who he is. And that's any guy can relate to that. There's an angle on that, and I think probably any woman could as well, even if they don't see it in themselves. They could see it in men they know. Masculinity is an incredibly complex subject that cinema deals with very, very badly all the time. So to have that fresh perspective opened up, even through a story about a sports film, a boxing film, that really on the surface is of no immediate interest to me, is a really, really great example of how that can happen. I think if you want to precipitate real change in that area, you have to work at it. You can't just let it happen organically, because the industry is already so far skewed over in the other direction. You have to use things like inclusion riders to say, okay, and it's not just a question of we're going to have a woman directing this. It's a question of we're going to have a woman being a cinematographer, we're going to have a woman production designer, we're going to have a woman doing costumes. Well, costumes is traditionally more kind of female-driven part of the industry anyway. But we're going to have people working at all levels of the industry who can work their way up or not, or become preeminent in their industry. Roger Deakins is such a brand name cinematographer. There is no reason whatsoever that there shouldn't be female brand name cinematographers like Roger Deakins, who you go along to the cinema and you're going to get a Roger Deakins looking film. There's no reason that shouldn't happen. But you would need to proactively work at getting these people, gig after gig after gig, so they can enjoy the same advantages that Roger Deakins has enjoyed for his entire career. Sam Mendes wants to make a Bond film, so he just picks up the phone and rings Roger Deakins. You have to make it so that there are women cinematographers in that same position, in order for that to kind of happen on a broader scale. So as far as inclusion riders are concerned, it seems like an easy fix. How that actually plays out, I don't know. We'll see if over the next few years, I suppose, as more production companies adopt them. But you have to make an effort. You can't just say, okay, we're going to stop being sexist, 3, 2, 1 now. You have to instead be proactive. You have to choose one person over another person. You have to give opportunities to people from different backgrounds, and that, I think, is the only way that you can address it. If you tokenistically bring someone in, and this is what I find very interesting about Star Wars, because people always talk about Star Wars needs a female director, Star Wars needs to have some kind of female director Star Wars film out there. And I agree, why not? It seems crazy that they don't. But then at the very top of Star Wars, you've got Kathleen Kennedy, obviously running Lucasfilm. In the Lucasfilm story group, they have a lot of female contributors. And in fact, the story group's headed by a woman as well. So they have, on certain levels, really female-driven. And I think you can see that reflected in the new Star Wars films very clearly. So you can't just make it tokenistic. You have to kind of look at doing it root and branch. I think there absolutely is. There's the possibility of making films incredibly cheaply that look good now that there wasn't even 5 years ago, because mobile cameras are so high res. Even the default lens is really good before you start clipping the anamorphic stuff on the top, as they did with Tangerine, to give it that kind of really lush LA look. But what it boils down to is kind of inspiration and perspiration, as it did beforehand. There's a sort of to an extent, there's a false economy with digital filmmaking, because since you can run a digital camera forever, in theory, you've got as much storage space as you can buy memory cards. You can get bogged down in digital filmmaking in a way that you don't necessarily get bogged down if you're using analog, if you're using Kodak film strips, because you have to, the medium forces you to be quick and to be clever about what you're shooting and what you're not shooting, and to really make your decisions more carefully. And I think to the extent that if you're to shoot a really low budget film on film, it doesn't really cost much different than if you were to shoot a really low budget film on digital. But the fact that these opportunities are there, I mean, if you're a film student, for example, you can piece together, with what you've got in your pocket, you can basically piece together a feature or a short, should you be so inclined. So to me, that's really exciting. I mean, as a critic, what is always primarily interesting is what does this new medium bring to cinema that you didn't have before. And in the case of a film like Tangerine, you have obviously, and Unsane as well, it's this incredibly sort of uncomfortably intimate aesthetic where you're basically being pulled along the street by these people. You know, you're crammed into the same space with them. There's an intimacy to it, and sometimes a kind of a difficult intimacy that you can't achieve with a traditional camera. And to me, that's very exciting. But I think, it's always marrying the right story with the right equipment. You would struggle, probably, might happen, I don't know, but you would probably struggle to shoot a period drama on an iPhone because the texture of the image feels intuitively wrong. It may happen, and it may kind of break box office records. Who knows? But it would have to be. I can understand why a film like Unsane works in that format, why a film like Tangerine works in that format, and why a film like The Florida Project doesn't work in that format. Sean Baker moved very deliberately from shooting on an iPhone on Tangerine. He went straight to 35 for these really kind of lush, dreamlike colours to kind of capture that 5-year-old, 6-year-old's eye view of that part of America, all these kind of bright colours and lush grass and everything. The Florida Project was not a high-budget film. So I'm very, very excited by it, but I think it would be sad if it became just the default go-to method for young filmmakers. What always excites me is that people really think through their projects and they choose the exact right way in which to express what they're going for. I think my only perspective on this is how similar kind of access-based issues have affected journalism and the media. And what you've seen is, on the one hand, with journalism and even just film criticism specifically, is this amazing democratization of voices. You've got lots of voices from lots of different backgrounds, all chiming in online. And you've got this, really, I think, although there's an awful lot of bad film criticism around now, there's more good film criticism, great film criticism than there ever has been. And it's because you've got all these different voices chiming in different perspectives. What's difficult about it, though, is very few of those voices are in a position to make a living from doing that. For a lot of people, I'm incredibly fortunate to be able to do this as my one and only job. A lot of people, it's a kind of a part-time job, and they'll do something else, they'll write about something else, or they'll do something completely different on the side as well. So I wonder if possibly film is going to go in the same direction, where you have an awful lot of voices out there, but actually having the resources to get noticed becomes exponentially more difficult because, people who are out there spotting talent, the equivalent of the editors in this office who are, looking around for new hires, there's just so much more to wade through. So I don't know. It's a really kind of a difficult part. It's a very dramatic kind of pivot point for the industry at the moment. I think if you want to make a feature on your own time and on your own dollar and put it online for people to watch for free, obviously you can do that now in a way that you could have never done 10 years ago. In terms of developing talent, making the second film, the fifth film, the 10th film, becoming a fully fledged filmmaker, my worry is that will be more difficult now. But that's purely based on what I've seen in journalism, which is, business-wise is what I understand. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for the great questions. It's a lot of stuff I never actually thought about before.